now. So I really am a firm believer in making growth intentional. And so I'm hoping today that I can add value to you regarding targeted small group instruction. Just a little bit about myself. Um, I currently serve as a national literacy consultant. I work in schools K through 12, which brings me to why I'm here tonight, because I'm just close to the work and I'm very concerned about a lot of our kids in our classrooms. I'm also John Maxwell certified speaker and coach. As an educator for 33 and a half years in Wisconsin, I served on all spaces in public education, third grade teacher, fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade English language arts, reading specialist, reading interventionist. I became a certified dyslexia interventionist. I also serve on the board of directors. I'm grateful with my colleagues. And I am a mom of a dyslexic child. And I love to spend lots of time outside. All 4 seasons. I went for a walk today, bundled up. It was beautiful and enjoyed a winter day. So I'm super grateful to be here today. Feel free to put any questions in the chat at any point in time. My colleagues are monitoring them, and they will let me know if there's something pertinent, and we can stop and talk. Okay. So really, what is my why? My why is as I have had the privilege in the last couple of years to travel across the country and support teachers as they're working towards implementing evidence-based practices and teaching their children to read. In all reality, I see a lot of whole group phonics instruction that's really not serving the majority of the children in the room. So today, that's what I'm going to be talking about. Targeted small group instruction that will prevent reading difficulties. So our intention today, right, is understand how to use data to create small groups, know the 8 characteristics of effective small group instruction, understand the elements of structured literacy phonics lesson, and take the research into practice. So we really cannot begin any conversation about how children learn to read without grounding ourselves in the simple view of reading. So this framework was developed by Goff and Tumner in 1986. And every time I speak to this model, I kind of just like, because I graduated with my undergrad in elementary education, grades 1 through 8, certified, and I graduated in 1989, and I didn't even know that the simple view of reading existed. So the reality is most of us have been coming into this work long after we got our college degree, and where we realized there was something not working for the majority of our children, right? And so what this framework teaches us is reading comprehension is a product. It is an outcome, right? It's an outcome of decoding times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. And so we know that a strength in one domain is not going to support a weakness in another. It is a product. And so we also know that children really will never, ever, ever get to reading comprehension, right? If they cannot decode the words on the page. And that was my daughter. She was a struggling reader, and I was a whole language balanced literacy teacher, and I really didn't know why she couldn't read because I read to her every day. And then I did it. I figured she would just eventually get it. But in all reality, we have a large proportion of our students in our class that need explicit systematic phonics instruction in order to have access to language and reading. Also, in the year 2001, Hollis Scarborough gave us this gift of her rope, the reading rope, the metaphor for reading. And again, we can't talk about instruction unless we ground ourselves in this model. Because this model teaches us, right? It teaches us that word recognition and language comprehension are areas of the rope, right? And our word recognition strand, which we say is the road to reading. It is the on-ramp to reading. Is what do we have to have here? We have to have, these are constrained skills, right? We know our kids have to be able to blend and segment sounds, and they have to be able to do that with automaticity. And we know that they have to be able to decode the sounds on the page, right? But they have to be able to do it with automaticity. They have to master those skills, right? And then once they master and have those patterns in their brains, it becomes words that we call sight recognition. And those aren't those sight words that we, use flashcards. Those are words that we really do. Kids automatically just recognize words upon sight. And they're only going to get to sight recognition is if they get lots and lots and lots of practice of decoding those patterns on the page, right? And for some of our kids, they need more practice than we realize. And the reality is they're just not getting enough practice. So I love this quote from Vaughn and Fletcher in a text identifying and teaching students with significant reading problems. So according to the researchers, Vaughn and Fletcher, the data suggests that approximately 95% of students can learn to read when provided high quality, evidence-based reading instruction. And this means that the vast majority of students are capable of becoming proficient readers with proper teaching methods. And I'm in classrooms where, honestly, I am seeing high quality, evidence-based reading instruction. But they do not have 95% of their kids in kindergarten and first grade reading, even though they have 30 minutes devoted to phonics instruction, and they have great high quality materials, and they're really efficient teachers. They're still not getting there, right? And so why is that? Well, the reality is, right? And I love this article, Linda Diamond, and Jeanette will drop it in the chat for you if you haven't seen it before. But in this article, she states the research that while whole class instruction is useful for building knowledge and reading comprehension, it is markedly less effective and less equitable when it comes to developing word recognition skills. And we are seeing a lot of whole group instruction, right? And I think when we think about this number, and I loved diving into this very old research about the hierarchy of learning as we think about why aren't our kids at 95%, even though we're giving them this good instruction. So in this hierarchy of learning, the first stage really is with our kids is the acquisition stage. And in the acquisition stage, they're just beginning to learn the skill. So in that stage, right, our goal as teachers is to make sure that we increase their accuracy. We want them to be accurate decoders of that CVC pattern or the silent E pattern or the vowel pattern. In order to get to accurate reading, these kids need a lot of blocked, masked practice, a lot of practice of that pattern so the brain can read it automatically, right? Then the next stage is called the fluency stage. And at this stage, the kids are accurate, but they're not fluent. So at this stage, we really want to increase automaticity, right? So they're reading the words, but they can read them quickly. So what do we need in our instruction? We need block practice, we need interleave practice, and we need distributed practice, and lots of practice. The next stage would be the generalization stage. And where we are there is where we have accurate and fluent readers, but they need to integrate it into the other skills, which means we want more interleave distributed practice at that stage. The final stage, I must have had a typo there. I don't know what is basically at that final stage is where we want fluent, accurate, which applies to all skills, okay? And basically they can use this in authentic text. So if you quick Google instructional hierarchy of learning, you can get the same article, okay? All right. So this is another piece of research that we have to understand when we think about the reading brain. So David Kilpatrick spoke to this in his book, Essentials for Difficult Reading Difficulties. The self-teaching hypothesis reinforces earlier research showing that in typically developing readers, the learning of new sight words occurs in 1 to 4 exposures. Now, friends who are in the classroom, you know you have some of those kids. You give them 1 to 4 exposures and they are accurate and they are automatic with that pattern. But that's not what's happening for all kids. So one of the great pieces of research that has come to us in the last decade really has been the work that Stanislaus Dehaene has done. And in his book, Reading in the Brain, okay? In his research, he basically has shown us through his research and his screening, right, that what happens with that reading brain is, right, we have that in the back of the reading brain, we have the visual input, and that's where the reading brain actually sees the letters on the page. And then what has to happen, right, is that visual input has to be connected to the frontal lobe of the brain, which we call the Broca's area. I'm not going to get really deep in language, but it's really the area where we produce and the articulation of sounds. That's where that is. What happens is the visual input, and once children learn to read, right, the brain repurposes itself, and in the bottom part of the brain here, this is where the visual word form area is. And that's where the brain actually recognizes those letters. And so we all know that reading isn't natural, right? We have to teach them. And we have to connect those sounds that we hear in our language to the letters that represent them. And we do that through explicit, systematic phonics instruction. And for some of our children, right, 1 to 4 exposures, and they're built that neural network in between those two lobes of the brain pretty easily. However, for majority of our kids, for the vast majority of kids who we would say are struggling to learn the code, right, those are the ones that have less activity in this part of the brain, the parietal temporal region of the brain. And the lack of brain activity, right, what that means for us as educators is these kids need a lot of practice. How much practice? Well, in this particular study, right, kids with dyslexia need 20 times the practice than students without dyslexia to learn letter sequences. So, for example, good readers may learn to rapidly spell a word with 20 repetitions and some 1 to 4. However, our poor readers may be challenged to reach automaticity with 400 repetitions. 400. And this comes from the book Multisensory Teaching. And this is where I think, friends, that we as classroom teachers we don't understand how much practice some of these kids need in order to gain accuracy and automaticity in those beginning stages of reading. So if you think about traditional, typical reading instruction, right? Usually what is happening, because I see it in classrooms all the time, what I see happening is our core instruction, students get about 30, maybe 35, 40 minutes in that core instruction. The students are getting their evidence-based phonics. And generally, if you really look at your curriculum, most time they're getting maybe 1 to 6 practice opportunities for each skill in that pattern. That's not enough for a lot of our kids. Many of our kids are going to need a lot more practice than what's provided in that whole group lesson. So then what they do is they get the whole group lesson and they don't get accuracy and they don't get the automaticity, right? And then they get to go to an intervention. And the intervention generally is 30 to 40 minutes. And what happens during our intervention time is they actually get a different phonics program than the core. And then it's teaching them a different lesson sequence than what they were just taught in their core. They get enough practice opportunities, but they're not getting enough practice opportunities on where they're at, and they're not getting enough practice opportunities of what's being delivered in the core. And for some of our kids, they go to a tier 3 intervention, which sometimes is a different program, which again gives them not enough practice opportunities for that pattern. So we have basically throughout our day, what? Not enough practice on that pattern for the students to gain what? Accuracy and automaticity in that initial stage. So we have to rethink, and we have to think about small group instruction, right? Research has shown that is more effective in closing that reading gap than whole group phonics instruction. And that's what we have, right? If you look at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, not enough practice, that gap is getting wider and wider and wider for a majority of our children. So in this study, in 279 studies from 1986 to 1992, 90% showed mastery learning worked well within the classroom setting, and most notably in small groups. A meta-analytic study found that small groups provided the highest effect sizes, especially for struggling readers. Multiple research studies have also concluded that whole class instruction does not afford students sufficient engaged reading opportunities. Not those 200 that some of our kids need. So, the strongest student outcomes resulted from increased engagement time on academic tasks and greater number of teacher-student interactions. So if I haven't convinced you already, we need to be rethinking our phonics instruction in order to give kids the opportunities to get enough practice to be accurate, automatic readers. So how do we do that? Well, we have to begin with a really good assessment system, because we have to find the kids that we need to find, and we have to make sure we identify where their skill gaps are. And in this great book by Susan Hall, if you haven't read it, the 10 Success Factors for Literacy Intervention, I'm going to speak to this book as I present this, the rest of this slide deck. So you might want to Google that one, okay? But what she states in her book, right, is that when students are placed in groups because they have the same benchmark score level, the approach doesn't go deep enough to help us understand why a student isn't at benchmark. And I see this happening in schools. So what I see happening is schools have a universal screening assessment, some sort of CBM, and sometimes schools don't even have a good CBM, but we need to have that, right? Because we have to find out which kids, and that oral reading fluency measure is going to help us really find the kids that we need to find. So it's important to remember that we have to have a CBM, and the CBM is going to be brief. It's 5 minutes. It's standardized. It's valid and reliable. It's predictive of reading risk. And it's connected to instruction. Now, I'm going to go back slide. In Wisconsin now, oops, I can put this in. In Wisconsin, we're asked to use Ames Web Plus. And so Ames Web Plus does have a CBM that's valid and reliable. So that's good news for Wisconsin teachers. We have that information in place. But we know, right, that that's not enough to figure out who are the kids that have skills gapped and how am I going to address that in the classroom? So we have to have a system of diagnostic assessments to inform small group instruction. And this is where a lot of teachers are not really sure where to go next. And so we have to think about that CBM or that standardized screener doesn't tell you what to teach tomorrow, but a diagnostic assessment will help you teach what's tomorrow, right? And so what we need to do is we want to dive deeply in one area, phonics, phonological awareness. So if our kids are struggling in phonics, particularly in kindergarten, we're going to want to dial back and see where they are with phonological phonemic awareness. These diagnostic screeners are only given to some students, usually the ones that are below benchmark on the universal screener. It's a one-on-one administration. It's usually a short amount of time, 10 to 15 minutes. Examples of phonological, and these are free. The PASS, the PAST, and the TOS is also out there. You can Google those if you don't have them. And then an example of a phonics assessment, you can get one from Really Great Reading, which is free, or you can get the Core Phonics Survey. Both are free. So the diagnostic assessment is the gateway to being able to group by skill, which really is the most essential requirement for robust results. So an example of a phonics survey would be, this would be an example of one from Really Great Reading that you could use with those students that scored below benchmark on your universal to really identify where they are with their skills gaps. And then what we need to know, right, is we need to know, where do I start to teach? And what we really do need is we need a curriculum that has a scope and sequence. And if we can't find a phonics scope and sequence in our curriculum, there's a problem. That means that we're not getting explicit systematic instruction. So one thing you want to make aware, whatever curricula you're using, make sure it has a clear scope and sequence. So once you identify that phonics survey, right, you have the big question. What do I do if I have students at all different levels? Well, if you're still teaching whole group, ideally what you need to do is this, students should be placed at a skill where they can achieve at least 70% correct on anything introduced for the first time, and 90% correct for parts of a lesson that deal with skills and information introduced earlier. So I think, and I struggled with this too. So I'm tutoring a student and he's in third grade, and I did everything that I said for you all to do. And I did a phonics survey, and I'm like, oh, I can see his gaps. And so I thought, well, I can start right here on the R control. Well, when I started on the R control, I discovered that he had gaps that didn't come through with the phonics survey, that I didn't realize he didn't have, because he was a third grade and he didn't get a lot of explicit instruction. So I literally just backed up the train. And so what I did with him is I just started with the CVC review. I started with the ending pattern reviews, and I kind of just went through and shored up all of those areas. And then I'm moving forward now through the scope and sequence to make sure he has all those foundational skills and the sub skills. So let's go back and thinking about this idea of small group versus whole group instruction, and what does our instruction look like? And this was from Stephanie Staller. She presented this in her Reading Academy, and this is a great graphic organizer that kind of explains your typical reading curriculum. So here are our grouping options after we do our assessment. So we can have a classroom teacher doing whole group lesson in Tier 1 that meets with 3 small groups for 15 minutes each. So in all reality, we're going to have 30 minutes of instructions. For the majority of the students, it's not at their level. So we're teaching grade level phonics that for the majority of the kids, it's not at their level. And then we give them 15 minutes of instruction at their level, and then they get 30 minutes in stations. So think about how much practice I shared with you for many of these kids, and all they're getting is 15 minutes of instruction at their level. Or we can have a classroom teacher does whole group phonics lesson in tier 1. We get tier 2 is 30 minutes of small group another time a day. So again, as I explained early, they get 30 minutes of target skill, not at their level. Then they get 30 minutes at their level. But it's still not going to close the reading gap because they're not getting enough practice. Or we can do a system called Walk to Read, in which classroom teachers and other adults do small group phonics lesson directly at each student's instructional level in tier 1. And then tier 2 is another 30, 45 minutes in small group, a different time of day with the same teacher. So then what we have is we get 60 to 90 minutes of skilled instruction to students at their level. We are going to close reading gaps. We are going to reduce the kids that are identified with learning disabilities. We're going to prevent learning disabilities if we give kids this kind of instruction all day long. So what does that exactly look like? So a typical, and you guys can, you're on this call, like you can say, my block isn't quite like that, but this was back to the reading first days, that a typical reading block, kindergarten through grade 2, they need 90 minutes of foundational skills instruction, and then plus an extra 30. So what does this look like in your reading curriculum, right? So we're not skill grouping all day long, because I know a lot of leaders say that's I forget the term, like we're putting kids into categories all day long, right? We're leveling them, but that's not really what we're doing, okay? So in 40 minutes, they're going to get their targeted small group instruction. They're going to work on phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency. Then they're going to get their whole group 50 minutes of their language comprehension. That's where they're going to get their vocabulary, their pre-reading, their during reading, their after reading, and their writing instruction. And then that extra 30 minutes, they're going to get that same small group instruction with that same teacher. So they get that 70 minutes, ideally a day, to get that phonics instruction. So what does that look like in real time if you were to do something like a targeted small group instruction? So you're going to have students at all different spaces of that scope and sequence. So if you have students that are at or above, okay, those are the kids that are going to get the trained teacher, the paraprofessional, and the larger group size, because they're already at grade level and we're just going to accelerate them through the scope and sequence. Yes, they're going to be accelerated. We would have one classroom teacher taking kids that are below grade level, about 10 students, and they're taking them right where they're at. Then we have another classroom teacher below grade level taking these 10 students right where they're at. Then we're going to perhaps maybe bring in our special education teacher and have 5 students and working where they're at. The most knowledgeable, the most skilled teacher, the most highly trained teacher is going to get the students that are the furthest behind and need the most intensive instruction. Now, that means you have to have a schedule that would work with this, right? Because if you don't have a schedule that's going to support, but that's something that we have to have conversations about. Because if we want to get to that 95% of our kids can read, we have to rethink how we're delivering our phonics instruction. So we have our small groups, but we have to keep in mind, and this comes from, again, Susan Hall's text, the principles of effective instruction. And I see this all the time. So we have to make sure in our instruction, we target one skill at a time. The skills are taught in a sequence. We give explicit instruction, systematic instruction, multimodal techniques, corrective feedback, minimal teacher talk, and with instructional routine. So what does that look like? Going back to that scope and sequence and going back to that phonics assessment, We have to target one skill at a time. That intervention time must be focused to be effective. We must provide students with ample time, and this is where I think we're missing, to master the skill. We have to teach it to the skill to mastery. And for some of our children, in decoding and in spelling, they're going to need a lot more practice for their brain to master that pattern. So I'm tutoring a student right now. She's in first grade. She has a neurodiverse brain. And I started working with her CVCs and then blends. I spent a month on blends before she was able to read them with automaticity and accuracy. That's how long it takes. So just keep that in mind, one skill at a time, teaching to mastery. Again, skills are taught in order from the most simple to the complex. Students should be able to achieve at least 70% correct on anything introduced for the first time and 90% correct for the parts that are reviewed. We want to make sure in our small group instruction that we are teaching explicitly. The teacher tells the new concept directly to students. I do. We do some we do practice, and then you do some you do practice. And along the way, we're giving them corrective feedback. I love this graphic. This was shared by Jen Surlis and adapted by Pam Kastner. And I like this because it explains to you, all of us, those kids that are the furthest behind need the most practice. Those are the kids that we would say are our tier 3 kids, our red kids. So those kids that have typical reading brains, 1 to 4 exposures, they have the pattern. But these are the kids that we know when we're in our small groups, we might have to do more modeling. We might have to do more we do together before we ever get to you do. The lesson should be systematic and have all the parts of a structured literacy lesson. This should start with a cumulative review, phonemic awareness, read sounds, read words, sentence reading, spelling the sounds, spelling the words, spelling the sentence, spelling irregular words, and going to that decodable or connected text. We want to make sure that we are systematic and we follow a script. Scripts are important because it helps us be efficient in our instruction. Scripts provide a consistent routine. It lowers the cognitive load on our children, and so then they can devote the attention to the task. Scripts are vital. For many of our kids, they're going to need scaffolding, and that's where we talk about multimodal techniques. For instance, with my student, if I'm asking her to blend or segment 5 sounds, and she starts segmenting and she misses a sound, I immediately go to my sound chips and my Elkonin boxes, and I have her drag those sounds into each box and then segment those sounds and then blend those sounds. So our kids, right, they do need those manipulatives, that scaffolding, those visual cues, the lines. I use a lot of lines and sound lines, circles, colors, just that extra scaffolding, particularly those who have challenges with working memory. We can only hold 7 items in our working memory at a time. And if we can't repeat the sentence, we got to put lines on the paper so they have that scaffolding to remember that dictation sentence. We have to make sure that there's no delay with error correction. And I think this is the challenge with whole group. So if you're doing whole group phonics, you have 20, 25 kids in your classroom, you're teaching the pattern. How can you get around to every single student to make sure that they are corrected immediately? It's impossible. We have to make sure that we might have to model the correction and we have to have them give them an opportunity to practice it. And we keep that cycle repeatedly until the new knowledge is actually transferred into long-term memory. This is important. Minimal teacher talk. I love this quote from Anita Archer. The one that's doing the talking is the one doing the learning. And so if we're spending a lot of our time talking, the kids aren't spending enough of their time practicing. So we need to use a minimum number of words. We have to listen to our students. We need to have good pacing. If the blending drill is 5 minutes, we have to keep it at that perky pace. When I go in classrooms around the country, what I'm noticing is pacing. Too fast, too slow, right? So we just have to make sure that we're aware of what our kids need. Second thing I want to talk about is, again, I'm going back to the work of Stanislaus and how we learn, is we have to make sure in our instruction, we're getting the kids' attention where they need to be. And I see in many classrooms, kids' eyes are everywhere, right? And so what I like to say to kids is eyes on print, eyes on me, eyes on print. Everybody, eyes on me. Everybody, eyes on print, fingers on print. We have to direct them where they need to go. This is harder to do in a whole class setting. But making sure that we're attending the brain, right, it leads to that active engagement and allows us to give that error feedback. So again, I'm going to show you like what a structured literacy lesson would look like. And Jeanette I created a little template for you and she can drop that in the chat. So you can guide that, because I can tell you your curriculum tools probably don't have a lesson sequence quite like this. So what we're going to have to do to give our kids the best instruction is we're going to have to just create that lesson that has all of these elements in it for our children, because that's what they need. We want to make sure that they have enough repetitions of the pattern. Most curriculum, they don't start with a cumulative review of all the previous patterns. Then we want to warm up the reading brain with some phonological awareness. We want to introduce the pattern. We want to give them blending practice, reading words, reading sentences. A lot of curriculum does not have word chaining in it. That's where the rubber meets the road. We want to make sure that we're doing that with kids. They have to spell words, do their sentence dictation, get the high frequency words, and get to that connected text. So you can see there's a lot here, right? And that's why we need a lot of small group time to get through this portion of the lesson throughout the day. So this is an example of what a cumulative review blocked interleave practice would be. Because my student has already had enough practice in blocked practice that she has basically mastered those individual patterns. So you can see what I'm working here with her is that Flizzle rule. That was my review. So we did the Flizzle rule, and you can see I'm bringing in the blends because she still needs to be automatic in those blends. And now I'm adding that inflectual suffix because she has to work on both of those sounds. We have to make sure that kids are getting that interleave practice every single lesson. Practice, practice, practice. Second part, we want to warm up the reading brain for the sounds that they're going to be seeing in this lesson. They're going to be learning that my student, actually, I did this lesson with my student, the sounds of ALL and OLL and ULL. And so basically, we're going to just blend and segment these sounds. And she has her Alconin boxes in her circle. And so she's blending sound, she's segmenting sound, she's getting her brain ready for the pattern that she is going to see. The next step would be introduce the new skill. You have your letter cards. Most curriculum has letter cards. We have to be cautious of them. Some of them are better than others. And so we're going to show them the letters. We're going to show them the pattern. Our brain is all warmed up and we're going to hear the sounds. We're going to see the sounds and we're going to spell the sounds. I will have opportunities to repeat other patterns. I just didn't have them in here. And so I'll introduce the sound is all, as in fall. What is the sound all? How do we spell all? ALL spells all. And then my student will take her paper and go, ALL spells all. ALL spells all. And we'll repeat that for ULL and OLL. That's introducing the new skill. Now, this is where we're going to get that practice in. We're going to make sure they are blending those sounds with the new pattern. They could be real words or they could be nonsense words. But we want to have those cards in front of kids and we want to use our blending boards and we're practicing blending those sounds. 5 to 20. Remember all the practice kids need. After we do the blending drill, what we want to do is that block practice. Remember in the initial stages, in the acquired stage, right? We want to give kids blocked, masked practice. So now she's going to go to the blocked, masked practice of this pattern. Now, step 6, you can see she's reading the sentences and it has all the patterns that I just introduced. Now, for many of my students, I want them not to read it word by word because we want to get to them proper phrasing. So we have to do some modeling here. Otherwise, our students are going to go, no, do not pull on the net. So what I like to say to my students is read the sounds in your head and give me a thumbs up when you're ready. All right? And we're going to work on phrasing. No, do not pull on the net. Now your turn. We'll do it together. No, do not pull on the net. Now your turn. No. And they read it. So I do, we do, you do. Because I want to make sure that there are phrasing and they're not reading word by word. And sometimes kids just have to hear that modeling. That's that I do, we do, you do in order to phrase those sentences correctly. Now, a lot of most curriculum, unfortunately, does not have this step in here, the word chaining step. And this is where we can get that orthographic mapping happening with these patterns. And for a lot of teachers, they just really don't know how to use the right language. Now, remember, the students are not given these words. I'm going to say to them, the first word is all. Let's finger stretch. All. What's the first sound? Aw. How are we going to spell that? A. What's the second sound? O. How are we going to, what's that letter? LL. Word, all. Now let's change all to ball. What sound changes? My kids always have a hard time with this. And they have a hard time with the addition. And I say, B. You're right. We added B. What letter is that? B. Now our new word, ball. Now we're going to change ball to bull. What sound changed? Ah to What letter? A to U. New word, bull. So this is really a critical piece that we get that into our lessons. Lots of our kids are going to need lots of practice with word chaining, and that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where you move your kids. Step 7 now would be that word spell, the encoding practice. So I'm going to give them some blocked practice, and then I'm also going to bring in some of that interleaved of practice of those previous patterns that I was taught. The last section would be the sentence dictation. And if you look at the sentences, right, I tried to bring in some of the other previous patterns that we taught. And not all curriculum is the same. So we really have to look at what patterns are we practicing. So I intentionally brought in that flizzle pattern. I intentionally brought in that suffix. I intentionally brought in that what? That blend. I want to bring those previously learned patterns into my sentence dictation because it gives them that interleaved spaced practice. So one thing that I like to do, and this came out of the research from the work of Michael Hunter and Linda Farrell did on the new science of high frequency words, and Jeanette will drop it into the chat, the article, is what they advise is giving kids time to read these words, and they call them flash words. Now, some curriculum might call them sight words, but how Michael and Linda arranged it is they arranged the flash words according to the patterns that were being taught. So this is actually what I do with my student. These are her flashwords, and you can see all of them are the blends and the flizzle patterns. And she reads them, and you can do timing with that. And the reason why I do that is I want to get her reading brain ready to really read that connected text more fluently and more accurately. So that's kind of how your small group targeted instruction should look and feel. So what does that look like across the day? That would be your first 30, 40 minutes, tier one. Your second 30 minutes, you'll basically go through the same lesson again. You might finish the lesson because you didn't have time and provide more practice in reading and spelling the pattern. You are going to just intensify it across tiers. It's not going to be a different program because we have to give them what? More opportunities to practice that pattern, to get it to mastery so they can be fluent decoders. Then what will happen again? That tier three, same program, same lesson, just more intensified. Usually these kids get a smaller group, they have more skilled teacher, but again, we're finishing that lesson, we're giving, and here we really want to make sure that they have mastered that pattern, but we're still bringing that interleave practice in. So I think it's important to remember, right? Skill is only developed by hours and hours of work. So I hope I gave you some food for thought to think about how you can rethink your instruction in phonics. You can find me if you have any questions or would like to reach out to me. Here is my email address. I give you my phone number too. If you want to text or call me, that's fine too. But you can reach me there. I feel very passionate about systematic, small group targeted instruction across all tiers of support because many of our students are not getting the practice they need to get to mastery and they're getting further behind. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing to see if anybody has any questions or if there's anything in the chat.
There are a couple things in the chat. Number one is some people are wondering if you're going to make a slide deck available. You can decide that. I know we put links to different articles in the chat, but you can decide.
They can email me.
Okay. Email
and then if they email me, I can, and I'll put my email in the chat in case some of you did not get it.
Okay. All right.
I'll put it here.
And then the next question that Megan had, I think is a question that a lot of people have. I've heard this question a lot when we're talking about whether we're going to be using whole group or small group for tier one. So she says, I just want to clarify, you're suggesting that tier one is not the regular whole group curriculum lesson, but more of a walk to read model for tier one based on the skills they need. This is the question I hear all the time. Shouldn't the low kids be getting on level skills or the gaps will get bigger? We do whole group tier one with scaffolds for low students and then use our win time to do our walk to read model based on core phonics. You want to tackle that?
Well, again, I honestly think, whole group instruction is not going to be at that level of the majority of the kids. And so basically they will, and you say you're scaffolded, but the reality is, my big question is, are they getting the same lesson in their tier two that they got in their whole group? Because if they're not getting the same lesson in tier two, then basically we're giving them cognitive load and we're not giving them enough practice, right? And I reach out to Mary too, because she's an expert in this space, and Katie too might have something to offer.
Well,
okay, Megan, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Megan, but it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you think, well, they're never going to catch up. Well, are they going to catch up if you use the bulk of your instructional time for a large group where they're so far behind that they're not getting anything out of it. How are they best? Yes, I think everybody agrees. That's the goal, is to close that gap and get them doing grade level work. How are you going to do it? And are you going to do it by putting them in grade level work that they're not ready for yet? And there is always the group level for discussing read alouds
Right,
and
and that's what I have in there,
comprehension.
right? They're going to get their 40 minutes of whole group
Yeah,
language instruction.
right.
But with those foundational skills, if we want to close those gaps and we want to get kids caught up, we got to give them that same instruction across all the tiers.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that you always have to consider, everybody's in a different sort of environment, so it depends on how many people you have available to help you and what level of skill they have at teaching,
Right.
right? So,
That's, I mean, that's
it's hard.
always, Mary, the challenge is called like the SWOT analysis, right? There are strengths and weaknesses and obstacles in every model, right? Whole group, walk to. I've seen it, right? I was in a school with walk to, and the teachers are absent. And how do you do groups when teachers are absent?
Yeah.
Um, then they say, then okay, then we'll do the flood-in model. And that means teachers come in at the same time, but you do need a schedule to support a flood-in model.
Yeah, I think the other thing we do have to be a little bit careful about is, yes, we do want to give our students that have the most needs, we want to give them the most skilled teachers, right? But we don't want to
Mm.
consign our very top students to always working with an aide, or, we also want to advance them as quickly as possible so they maximize their potential. And so if your classroom includes gifted and talented students, you're going to want to make sure that if you're not personally instructing them, you're going to want to make sure that you've given very explicit instructions to whoever is working with those kids so that they're
Right.
moving forward and not
So
getting back.
Mary, in my model of the walk to, our kids that are at or above are getting structured literacy. They're just getting accelerated. So they're accelerating through the scope and sequence because they need 1 to 4 exposures, and then we can accelerate them through the phonics patterns. And if they accelerate, then we get them to Latin and the Greek roots. We start getting to multi-syllable.
Right. And then we
So
just have to
all
be
kids are
careful.
getting phonics instruction at the same time.
Yeah. And we just have to make sure that everybody who's teaching all those levels, the kids who are at the top who are getting the accelerated work, we have to make sure that they have an instructor who's capable of delivering that instruction so that they actually accelerate.
Well, I mean, that's per your
Oh,
point. That's why they have to have
yeah,
the structured literacy plan, and they have to have the curriculum, and they have to have the tool. Yes, to your point. I just want to make
yeah.
sure we have the other questions here. So, Vanessa, this is always a hard one when the best way to influence is unfortunately data's that's not moving, and you're not closing the reading gap, because I say this to teachers all the time. You can't keep giving them the same thing and expect different results, right? We can't keep in this system of whole group and small group and tiers and expect different results. It's not working for them. We're not closing the gap. Our kids are still struggling. And Pamela, multilingual learners, thank you for asking that question. So, the research is really clear that the science of reading applies to all learners. And for our students who are our multilingual learners, right, what we have to do as educators, and I teach this to teachers all the time, is we have to leverage their first language into English. We have to know the sound system, the phonology, and the orthographic system of their home language, their first language, to leverage it into English. And that's what I tell teachers to do.
Did you get Vanessa's question? I was kind of
I
busy
just asked her,
posting things.
what
So,
strategies your method? You teach them structured literacy, the same strategies, right? You teach them the structured literacy, you teach them the code. However, you have to know that what vowels are in Spanish that are not in English. And that these are the sounds we hear in Spanish. This is the sound we hear in English. And Pamela, I'm gonna say that Elsa Cardenas Hagen has done a lot of work with teachers on how to implement structured literacy for our multilanguage learners. You can find her webinars all over.
Yeah, she has great stuff and so does Antonio Fierro. So if you see those two names, check that out. Is it, we got Pamela, but did you get Vanessa? She was ahead
I think
of
so.
Pamela. I just wasn't sure
Yeah,
because I was
she asked about
posting
how to
things.
influence, and I said data.
Okay, all right,
I
okay.
said data because that's the only way you can lead from where you're at. I'm just reading a really good book on how to lead from where you're at, leading from the middle. Leadership is influence, right? Nothing more, nothing less. And so what you need to do is you need to be the big influencer. You need to bring the research. That research article is in the chat. Jeanette put it in there about small group instruction. You can use that. Um, Share them nuggets of research, share them nuggets of what's not working for your kids based on your data, and just it takes time. Unfortunately, our kids are on the line, but it's the human condition in schools. It's part of the complexities of change. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's good. Anybody else have any other big questions, thoughts they want to share for the good of the order?
I did put the link in for our March virtual presentation. It is on multilingual learners in the classroom, and that'll be on March 4th. So please register for that if that's a topic that's of interest to you.
And who's teaching?
That is Magdalena. Help me out here, Jeanette. Can you remember what her full name is? Hold on a sec. Find out.
Yes, you will get the recording on YouTube channel. Oh,
Yeah,
It's Magdalena Savalia.
Savalia. Yeah.
all
Okay.
right. Thank
All
you so
right.
much. You have a good night, and Mary will put this on the YouTube channel for
Yes, I
the
will.
whole world to see. You can stop recording now.